Okay, so we're going to finish the action potential story, and then we are going to, at the end of this set of notes, start talking about some pathophysiologies that will help to like reinforce how all of this kind of stuff works. Okay, so we are going to start where we left off last time, and I know you guys have slept since then, so let's make sure that you remember how this whole story starts. So remember that this whole story is going to start basically with a neuron, right? And so we're talking, in this set of notes, we're talking about action potentials in neurons. We will see that they're really similar in muscle cells, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so if I'm trying to get to an action potential, you guys remind me, okay? I'm going to start on the cell body, right? And I have a whole bunch of chemical, and it's going to bind to, if I want an action potential, it should bind to chemical-gated what channels? Sodium, right? Because if I bound to chemical-gated potassium channels, I wouldn't get closer to an action potential, right? So let's say we've got a whole bunch of acetylcholine and it's going to bind to acetylcholine-gated sodium channels, right? If it depolarizes enough, let's say this is the axon hillock, if it depolarizes enough to get the axon hillock to -55, I'm going to engage another kind of channel. What is it? A voltage-gated sodium channel, exactly. So I'm going to open the first voltage-gated sodium channel. And the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to be lined up like dominoes all along the cell membrane. So if I open this one, it will cause further depolarization, right, which will make it more likely that this one will get to -55, right, all along the entire cell to the end, right? Okay, but then the last thing we were talking about last time is we were trying to get to the idea of how you repolarize the cell, right? Remember? Okay, so what I'm going to need in order to repolarize the cell is I am going to have to do what to the voltage-gated sodium channels? Close them. I'm going to have to engage another kind of channel, which is what? Potassium channel, and it will be voltage-gated. I'll teach you how it's voltage-gated in just a second. It's a voltage-gated potassium channel. I'm going to have to open that one. And then I'm going to have to deal, after I get the voltage fixed, I'm going to have to deal with the fact that the ions are in the wrong place, right? Okay? So I'm going to have to deal with the fact that I've got all of my ions screwed up. So now we're going to go back to this figure that we've dealt with before. And we're going to say, okay, so I got to -55 and I opened my voltage-gated sodium channel, right? And then I'm going to move over. I'm going to close that voltage-gated sodium channel. I'm going to open a voltage-gated potassium channel and pump. Now, that's not the way I have to do it. Conceptually, you could depolarize the entire cell and then repolarize the entire cell. But do you see that if you did that, you would have a lag time in which the cell could not be used again, right? So instead of doing that, when I'm dealing with tissues that need to be instantaneously responsive, like nervous tissue, right, I need to chase depolarization with repolarization. So what actually happens along the axon is open voltage-gated sodium channel, closed voltage-gated sodium channel, open voltage-gated potassium channel, pump, right? Open voltage-gated sodium channel, closed voltage-gated sodium channel, open voltage-gated potassium channel, pump. All the way until I get to the end of the cell. Does that make sense? So ideally, you will have a very short lag time in which the cell can't be used again. It's super duper important that it's short in nervous tissue. And it resets really quickly in nervous tissue. Second most quickly is skeletal muscle tissue, and then cardiac, and then smooth. Those are the quickest to reset in order. So let's talk about what this story that we've been telling, and then I'll show you an animation too, has to do with this figure that we've got right here. So we're going to start with the whole thing over again and make you guys put in the important players. Please note that once you open the first voltage-gated sodium channel, you are going to have not a minor depolarization, but a massive depolarization, because you are going to open every single voltage-gated sodium channel along the entire cell, right? You don't open one and not the others, so you're going to have a massive depolarization. This is part of your action potential. But before we get there, I want you guys to remind me of the things that you've already known, and that is one question before we even get into messing with it. What kind of channels are responsible for me resting at -70?
The leak channels.
Leak channels, exactly. So this is leak channels. And what is this called? something something potential. So that is called resting membrane potential. And remember, this starts out with just the unequal leaking of sodium and potassium, right? Okay, so now I'm going to do this upsweep from here to here, right? From minus 70 to minus 55, okay? So first question about this is, what kind of channel is involved there?
Chemical gated.
Yes, chemical gated, what channels? Sodium. And this is the one that the other class couldn't quite get. What kind of potential is this?
Positive.
It's not resting, and it's not action. What is it? The other one. Graded, exactly.
I think that it's on grade.
Yeah. So this is a graded potential. But to be more specific, guys, it's a depolarizing graded potential, right? And just so you know, all cells in the body, not just electrical cells, have this and can have those. But what gets to be unique is that only electrical tissues are going to have the next kind of channel, which is the voltage-gated channel, right? So now, let's start moving up here. From here all the way up, from minus 55 all the way up, what kind of channel is probably involved here? What is it?
Sodium gated voltage.
You got all the words, get them in the right order. Voltage, gated, sodium, channels.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
What does graded potential mean?
Yeah, graded means it implies that it can be strong or weak, right? Because you can have a strong graded potential or a weak graded potential. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, it implies that there are different grades of them. So I'll show you that in just a minute. I'll show you a couple of different graded potentials. So this is a voltage-gated sodium channels, right? And then what kind of potential is it here? Yeah, that's an action potential. The only unique part of this story so far is these, because only nervous cells and muscular cells have those voltage-gated. That's why they're the only ones that can have action potentials. Everybody okay with that? And so now what we need to do is we need to reset it, right? So we let massive amounts of sodium in, but we are going to have to repolarize it. So you guys tell me conceptually, what should I do at the top of this loop, at the top of this hill? You should do what? Close sodium, and then what? And then all the way down, it will primarily be what kind of channels that are involved here? They are voltage-gated, although I haven't taught you how that works yet. I will in a second. They are voltage-gated potassium channels. And they are primarily involved in the repolarization phase of the action potential. Does that make sense? So the channels are actually involved. Do you guys hear that buzz? Okay, I'm just going crazy. All right. Yeah. There's little voices telling me to do things too, so let's be fine. Okay, so we'll go back to your notes for a second. Okay, so an action potential is a larger wave of depolarization. It moves down the entire cell without losing magnitude. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But it doesn't lose magnitude because if you open one, you end up opening all of them. And it's a massive rush of sodium in. Although, and all action potentials that we've ever found are depolarizing. I don't know why. They could theoretically be hyperpolarizing. I mean, it would work, right, if you got a whole bunch of potassium move out for an action potential, but we've never found any that are that way. So they're all depolarizing, and it moves as a wave down the axon of the cell. And so the electrical change is super dramatic in an action potential. It can go all the way from minus 55 all the way up to positive 30. Now, I know that crunches some people's brain to figure out how you can flip the charge. But all it really is if you let so many positives in, right, you can go from being negative on the inside to positive on the inside. You don't stay there for very long, but you just let such massive amounts of sodium in all at the same time that you can flip the charge for a second, so you can go past zero. Okay, so Come here. There it is. Okay, so the repolarization phase, and I'll show you an animation. So with the repolarization, we want it to chase the depolarization, otherwise we end up with a distinct lag time. And so the way that that works is the voltage-gated sodium channels close and the voltage-gated potassium channels open. And then you get the number fixed, but you don't have the locations of the ions fixed. Please note that the sodium-potassium pump is actually not drawn in here, because the sodium-potassium pump really isn't changing the voltage, right? It's not making any measurable changes in the voltage. So of course it was responsible for the initial ion concentration gradient, but what it really does with this story is primarily once you get the number fixed, it just switches the position of the ions. So even though it is a player here, it really isn't drawn in here because it doesn't do anything to the number, right? Not anything major to the number. Okay, so let's look at an animation that will show you sort of a visual of what's happening here. Okay, so our players here are the voltage-gated sodium channels. Please note that that one has 2 gates. That'll be important in just a second. This is a voltage-gated potassium channel. They didn't draw in any of the chemical-gated or anything else. They're just showing you the voltage-gated ones. And the ions correspond to their gate, the colors do. Okay, so what's going to happen is as soon as you hit minus 55, you are going to open the gate of that voltage-gated sodium channel. So where am I on this graph right now? Yeah, you are minus 55 and up. That's what you're doing. So all of this time you're going minus 55 and up. Now, conceptually, I wish that it was always true that you close the damn sodium before you open the potassium. But it's not, because it doesn't really matter what order you do it in. Does it make sense to you that when you're at the top, you can either open potassium and it'll stop, right? It's like you're going up, 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 and then you start heading down, right? Or you can close the sodium before you open potassium. It doesn't really make any difference. I would like for you to put away one toy before you start playing with the other one, because I'm mom, right? But they don't do it that way, because this is a toddler, apparently. Okay, so you don't have, this one particularly shows you the potassium opening before you close the sodium. So where am I on the graph here? You're sort of coming around the top curve, right? And then if you give it a minute, you're still like at the top. And then if you give it a minute and the sodium channel closes, which I think it will do right now. He's talking to you. Okay, so now where am I? Now it's only potassium that's moving, so you're heading down. Does that make sense? Okay, and so your potassium channels are open and you're still going down, and then you're resetting your sodium channels and your potassium channels, and we'll come back to what that's doing in just a second. So do you see what's actually going on? Okay, so let me go back to the concept that these potassium channels are voltage gated. The potassium channels are voltage gated, but they're set at a voltage that you always hit after the sodium channels. You guys with me? So I can't set those voltage gated potassium channels at minus 55, or else I would contradict what I was trying to accomplish. So I have to set them somewhere on this upsweep, right? So usually, I don't want to make you memorize it, but usually conceptually they're set somewhere between 0 and positive 30. But that dependably happens after minus 55, right? So it forces a lag time between when you open your sodium channels and when you open your potassium channels, okay? Does that make conceptual sense to you guys? So they are voltage gated, they're voltage gated potassium channels. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, they as long as they lag behind, then they're, remember that this is all going one direction, right? So different things are happening at that end of the cell than are happening at this end of the cell. And this is measuring the entire cell. Go ahead.
And positive 30 is not always the set number, right?
No, So this is, when they show you this, this is kind of the average between varying neuron types and muscle types. So this is not true for every cell, but this is true-ish for all of the electrical cells, right? So the numbers are only a little bit useful to memorize. So they always start around minus 70, and threshold is around minus 55, and you usually go past 0, but not necessarily to 30. Okay, so this is just sort of averaged over all of the electrical cells that we have. Okay, so So you've just drawn this. On the diagram above, sketch the membrane potential recorded in a neuron as it depolarizes to threshold, undergoes an action potential, and repolarizes to resting membrane potential. So now let's talk about what happens in the cell and how we can use it again. So conceptually, we understand that in order to get a second action potential, does it make sense to you that a couple of things have to happen? First of all, I have to get the ions replaced to where they're supposed to be, right? But then in addition, I also have to depend on the condition of these channels. So let me show you something. So now I'm going to look at this cell, and I'm going to get to this point, which is threshold. Okay, and remember that maybe I got there because I just dumped a whole bunch of acetylcholine down on that end of the cell, right? Which opened enough chemical-gated sodium channels to hit threshold, right? You guys with me? Now, what if I dumped more acetylcholine right now at this point on the cell? Can I get another action potential? No, because you're in the middle of the first one, right? And your voltage-gated sodium channels are busy, right? You can't have another action potential. And so watch. So this, by the way, is called refractory period. The refractory period is the period of time during and after an action potential when you can't get another one, okay? And so watch. I'm in a refractory period, obviously, right now because I'm still busy with the first action potential, right? But then in addition, still in refractory period because that sodium channel is still open. You can't open it again when it's still open, right? But also right here, aren't I still in refractory period here? Because I can't get sodium to move even if I did open it, right? So I'm still in refractory period right there. And then here, I'm out of the major refractory period, but it's still going to be really hard to get an action potential because I'm working against those potassium channels, okay? So let's put some words to that. So those things are called, the refractory period is the period of insensitivity to another stimulus. And how insensitive are you? Refractory period you probably learned about in human sexuality. Although, I'm in Utah. You probably didn't learn about human sexuality. Okay, so refractory period is a period of time in a male after an orgasm that you can't have another one no matter how hot she is. Doesn't even make any difference, right? And so the absolute refractory period is no way, no how, not going to happen. So no second action potential can be generated no matter what. And really that has primarily to do with the position of the voltage-gated sodium channels. If they are not reset to their original position, so if they are not reset to here, you can't get another action potential, right? Because even if I could get them to open, sodium would not move, right? Okay, so the absolute refractory period, as long as your voltage-gated sodium channels are still busy, you can't get another action potential. You have to reset them totally. So that's called the absolute refractory period. And then the relative refractory period is when your voltage-gated sodium channels have reset, but one of two things might be true. Either your potassium channels are still open, which is going to make it harder to depolarize, right? Or you are in this situation in which you're slightly hyperpolarized, right? And so you're sitting at minus 80 instead of minus 70, which makes it harder to get to minus 55. Does that make sense? So that's called the relative refractory period. And the relative refractory period, you might get an action potential, but if you got the first action potential with 100 molecules of acetylcholine, you might need 300. Right? It's just harder to depolarize if your potassium channels are open or you're slightly hyperpolarized, right? So this one is no way, no how, you're not going to have it, it's not going to happen, I don't care how hot she is. This one is, if she is your absolute fantasy, it could happen. Absolutely could happen. Super motivated to make it happen. Okay. So that is called absolute and relative refractory period. So relative refractory period is usually right after your voltage-gated sodium channels have reset. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about something that comes up with this concept. Okay, so now let's talk about what action potentials have to do with weak or strong stimuli. Here's the truth about an action potential. In a cell, there is no such thing as a strong action potential or a weak action potential, because here's the deal. If it's a subthreshold stimulus and it doesn't get there, I don't get an action potential, right? But if it's a threshold stimulus, even barely, I get an action potential. But if it's a really strong stimulus, I still get the same damn action potential because I open every single voltage-gated channel on the entire cell, regardless of whether I barely got to threshold or went way past threshold, right? So this is the all or none property of action potentials. You either get all of them to open or none of them to open. So that brings up an interesting question, and the question is, well, if that is true, how do you code intensity with the nervous system? If it's not strong or weak action potentials, then what it actually is the frequency of action potentials. So with the frequency of action potentials, so let's talk about this. This is simplified action potentials. When you usually see them on an ECG, that they just, or I'm sorry, EEG, they just represent its spikes. So let's talk about what we're talking about here. So I'll give you a decent example to think about. What is the difference between me poking my finger with a pin and the intensity of the pain that is coming in, right? Versus cutting my damn finger off, the intensity of the pain that is coming. Now let's imagine that we're controlling for area, right? We're hitting the same number of sensory receptors. So what's the difference? The difference is this. If I poke my finger with a pin, the intensity comes in like this. Pain, pain, pain. But if I cut my damn finger off, it goes as fast as it can possibly go. Pain, 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 pain. Which depends on the refractory period. You have to reset it quickly, or else you cannot use frequency of stimuli to code for intensity. Does that make sense? So you have to reset it very quickly so that you can use it again. This is the difference between smelling a slight funky odor, right, and smelling something that smells like 100 farts, right? That is frequency of stimuli going in. That's what it is. So your entire nervous system uses frequency coding. So let's bring it back to the chemical idea. What I mean is, if I had a subthreshold stimulus, then I don't get any action potentials at all. But what if I had 15 molecules of acetylcholine? Then I get one action potential, right? But what if I had 20 molecules of acetylcholine or 50 molecules of acetylcholine? What happens is the acetylcholine starts the first action potential, and then I repolarize, but then there's more acetylcholine, and it starts another one, right? And then there's more acetylcholine, and it starts another one. So what if I had 5,000 molecules of acetylcholine? Well, it's going to keep going, right? It's going to keep going as long as I can repolarize quickly enough that it can be sensitive to the next stimulus. Does that make sense? So this is true all about the nervous system. The nervous system uses frequency coding. It uses frequency coding for sensory stimuli. It also uses frequency coding for muscular stimuli. So one of the differences, not the only one, but one of the differences between me using my biceps brachii to lift a pen, right, and my biceps brachii to attempt to lift a Volkswagen is how quickly the nervous system is telling my muscles to contract. How do I get it to contract at its maximum capacity? Send more frequent stimuli to it, right? So frequency coding in, out, and also within is how your nervous system actually communicates intensity. Does that make sense? And that all depends on the repolarization rate and the refractory period. But this is why I can come back to that concept that I said before. The fastest tissue to repolarize is your nervous tissue, which needs to be pretty damn responsive, right? The second tissue, the second fastest is skeletal muscle. Third is cardiac, and fourth is smooth, which you don't use for any emergencies, right? You're just like, it's just like the swath of muscle tissues. Go ahead.
So is that how adrenaline, like if you were in a situation where you have, to lift something, like, does the adrenaline make the action potential?
Yeah, it makes the action, let's just like limit it to cardiac muscle. So, because we know what adrenaline does to cardiac muscle, it tends to increase the heart rate, right? Okay, so if I get into a situation and a Volkswagen falls on my baby, a million different things happen, but let's just hold it to this one little thing that we're going to concentrate on. One of them is that my adrenal glands dump massive quantities of adrenaline into my system. And the adrenaline, your heart doesn't care how the chemical messenger got there. It could be a neurotransmitter, but it could be adrenaline that was in my bloodstream. So what happens with my heart is that I bathe my cardiac muscles in adrenaline, right? And then it increases my heart rate, but then as soon as they repolarize, I've got more adrenaline, right? So my heart rate keeps going up and up, right? So it's still frequency coding. The whole thing with electrically active tissues is frequency coding. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so, all right. So frequency coding. So now the thing that I haven't talked about is the difference between myelinated and unmyelinated axons. And I specifically don't do this until the end because it can throw some people. Okay, so the entire story that I've been telling you is about an unmyelinated axon. And with an unmyelinated axon, that's how your neurons communicate with other neurons that are right next to them. Because it's not a very long axon that you have to get to go from neuron to neuron. So this is happening all over your brain. But what if I need the stimulus to go for a really long distance? Like I've got a neuron cell body that's up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord, but the axon runs all the way down to my little toe. Isn't that impressive in me? But with some tall people, it would be pretty damn impressive. Okay, so it's going to run all the way down to my little toe. What happens is you're going to have to do something to insulate that axon and speed up the transmission. So here's how we said it worked first, and this is in an unmyelinated axon. All of the little bitty dominoes are right next to one another. All of the voltage-gated sodium channels are right next to one another. So if you depolarize with this one, it causes an electrical change that's enough to hit threshold in the next one, right? So they're all right next to one another. But with a myelinated axon, it works slightly differently. It still works on the same principle, but metaphor that works for this one is it's way bigger dominoes. So what happens is this one, the axon hillock hits minus 55, and it hits it pretty massively. It goes to minus 55, a big influx of sodium ions, right? So it goes way past minus 55. But what happens in these is this one actually will not, there are not going to be any other voltage-gated sodium channels until I hit this node, okay, called a node of Ranvier or a neurofibril node or whatever the hell you want to call it. It's always called a node. Okay, so here's what happens. The myelin actually insulates the axon and keeps ions from moving until you get to the node. So think of it this way. Imagine a Pyrex dish, right? It's got water in it. I'm going to tightly put saran wrap across it. I'm going to smack it from the side. Do you see that the wave is actually going to go under the saran wrap and it would come out the other side if it was given the opportunity? You're doing the same thing with the electrical nature here. You're creating a massive electrical change at the axon hillock, and then you're not letting any ions move as they move through this intracellular fluid under the myelin, right? And so what happens is you should insulate and hold on to that charge until you get to the node, right? And then you start it again at the node, right? It opens the voltage-gated channels, it starts a big, massive voltage change, and then you hold on to it. So how they usually refer to this, they say it looks like it's jumping, right, from one node to the other, but I think it looks like it's diving, right? So it's actually diving under, right, and then you hold on to the charge, and then it dives under, and then you hold on to the charge, right? So they call this saltatory conduction. If you speak Spanish, saltar means to jump, right? Okay, so it looks like it's jumping. It's faster, okay? It causes a faster speed of transmission, and it's used for myelinated axons, and any axon that's after a certain length is going to be myelinated, have to be myelinated in order to get the transmission to go. But I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to ask you about MS, which is a demyelination disorder. Okay, so with this, that means that you're only going to have the voltage-gated channels that you need at the nodes. You guys with me? That's why I think of it more like big dominoes. So you can get this big one, fall over enough to hit the next big one. So now what I want to ask you is, what happens with demyelination disorders, in which I have an autoimmune disorder that starts demyelination? If you demyelinate a myelinated axon, will it still work? No, it won't, because there's nothing in between, right? I have a whole bunch of voltage-gated sodium channels, right? And then I have to hold on to the charge underneath them before I get to these voltage-gated sodium channels. So it's basically like I don't have any little dominoes, right? I've got a big one, right? And then I wasn't able to hold on to the charge to hit the next big one. So what happens is if it is a myelinated axon, it is not set up to behave like an unmyelinated axon, right? And if you start taking off the myelin, they don't work at all. You start losing control of your muscular activity, for instance, with demyelination. That makes sense? Just because of the anatomy of the axon. It doesn't have them lined up. So you're not going to depolarize there and not hold on to the charge and have it depolarize here. Okay, go ahead.
So, in those disorders, there's not like a threshold where they would still have some minimal feeling?
Oh, well, yeah. This is per neuron, okay? And the autoimmune disorder does not equally demyelinate all the axons. So if I had 10,000 axons that were generating, that were sending stimulus to my muscles, right? And I demyelinated a tenth of them, then I would have some loss in my muscle strength and activity and control, right? No, it doesn't. It's not total. It's total per neuron.
Oh, I see.
Right? Because as soon as you lose your ability to knock over the second domino, it doesn't go anymore, right? But it's always more than one neuron that's involved in the process.
So once you demyelinate a portion of the neuron, right, or the nerve, are you lose complete control over that one?
It doesn't. Once you stop the signal, it can't go. It's like basically a bridge is out, and it's the only way to get across, right? The bridge is out, and you can't get across, so you're not going to get across.
Other neurons that are.
Other neurons have to send a signal. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one more question. I had a patient with MS who had major spasms in his legs. So.
I don't know how the spasms work. I'll have to think about that one. It's a good question. I wonder if it was medication.
Yeah, medications to control spasms.
I'll have to think about that one. Okay, so that's myelinated versus unmyelinated. So one more time. On a myelinated axon, you will only have the voltage-gated channels here at the nodes, right? You're not going to have them underneath the nodes, and that's an important thing. Other than that, they work the same. It's the same story, right? Okay, so for those of you who are very visual people and like to mess with things and want to see how this all works, Interactive Physiology has a really good review of the action potential. You can go through it, you can play with it, you can watch things move. They have really hard quizzes, which is good. So it's in Nervous System 1, the action potential. Okay, all right, so any questions? Because we're about to start to mess with it with some pathophysiological conditions. Okay, so when I throw patho in, I always do it to help reinforce the normal physiology, okay? And not even because I am actually an expert in this kind of stuff, but if you can see how it's supposed to work and I break it, you should be able to figure out what's going to go on. Okay, so with these ion composition disorders, these are either too much or too little of an ion, okay? And that can happen because of, remember with dehydration, if you lose fluids, you're going to lose hydrophilic substances like ions, right? Okay, or you can get excesses. A really good way to lose excess fluid, diarrhea, diuretics, sweating, vomiting. As a matter of fact, these ion composition disorders are leading causes of children still worldwide because diarrheal diseases kill kids. And it's not the loss of fluids, it's the loss of ions. And we'll start to see these. Okay, so what I want you to know, and you have to know this because when you get home, try to study this. If you don't know how to read it, you're going to hate everything about it. So with each one of these, the title is the actual disturbance, and then the things listed after happen because of the disturbance, okay? So, hypokalemia. First question to you is, where is your ion composition more likely to be disturbed? Extracellular fluid or intracellular fluid? ECF. Yeah, ECF, right? Okay, right? So you're more likely to have an extracellular fluid disturbance. So all of these disturbances occur in the extracellular fluid first. What do I mean? I mean, when I'm throwing up my guts, I tend to lose a lot more extracellular sodium than intracellular sodium, right? And so if I'm taking in too much of anything in my diet, it's going to go into my ECF before it's going to go into my ICF, okay? So this first disturbance is called hypokalemia. It implies what level of what ion where? Less potassium in the extracellular fluid. That's the disturbance. Got it? Okay, so now, what is this? How's this going to impact the cell? Well, this is going to impact the concentration gradient for potassium. Okay? So it means that the concentration gradient for potassium is going to be steeper than normal, because what is it normally inside to outside? 30 to 1. And now I just lost some, so it's 30 to 0.1, right? Which is 3 to 1. You guys with me? Okay, so I just lost a whole bunch of extracellular potassium. So the did it wrong way. I was doing hyperkalemia. Scratch that. I was testing you. Okay, so now 30 to 0.1, which is 300 to 1. Okay, 30 to 0.1. You guys with me? And now its concentration gradient is much steeper than normal. Okay, so let it sit there for a minute with the concentration gradient for potassium being 300 to 1. Tell me what potassium is going to do at rest before I even try to do any graded or action potentials or anything. What's potassium going to do? It's going to leave the cell, right? So you're going to let it sit there for a minute at rest with that concentration, 300 to 1. And then the cell is going to relatively quickly get what? Depolarized or hyperpolarized? Hyperpolarized, because potassium is moving out. Everybody okay with that? So now the cell is sitting at rest. Instead of minus 90, it's sitting, instead of minus 70, it's sitting at minus 90. Okay? Now it's going to matter when I try to get to threshold, right? It's going to be much harder to get to threshold from minus 90 than it is from minus 70. So it's going to be harder to depolarize to threshold and harder to send in action potential. It's not like you're in absolute refractory period. It's like you're in relative refractory period. So if you could have started a stimulus with 10 molecules of acetylcholine, maybe it'll take 100. But you could still potentially get it, not as dependably. So what's going to happen is you're going to end up with muscle weakness because, remember, muscle strength is coded by frequency. But I'm not getting them every time, right? You are going to have fatigue, both mental and physical fatigue. You are going to have sluggish reflexes. And importantly, you're going to have cardiac arrhythmias, because what your heart should do is contract when you tell it to, right? And you tell it with an action potential, only you're not getting action potentials every time. Maybe you're getting them every 5th time, right? And so you're going to end up with cardiac arrhythmias. That make sense? Okay, and cardiac arrhythmias are, of course, risky because they can increase your likelihood of heart attacks and also strokes, right? Okay, but mostly heart attacks. Okay, so what can cause this? Decreased intake, but we're talking like starvation level decreased intake, not just like normal people levels decreased intake. Persistent vomiting, diarrhea, and diuretics. Massive impacts on your ions when you are losing those kinds of things. This is a big, big deal, not just for children. So, you know, when you have kids and they're losing a bunch of body fluids, not only do you have to get their fluids rehydrated, but you have to get their ions rehydrated. And so they have to drink Pedialyte or Gatorade or whatever the hell you can get them to drink, because Pedialyte tastes terrible. Oh my God. My kids are like, really? No? I'm like, okay, just drink all of these things, and I'm going to put some salt in it. Vomiting, diarrhea, and diuretics. Not only does it impact kids, but these are really, really risky for people who have anorexia or bulimia. So one of the reasons that people who have anorexia or bulimia are so at risk for lots of different disorders is because, I don't know if you guys know this, but a lot of people who have anorexia or bulimia tend to take diuretics pretty frequently to flush water from their system. And they're taking over-the-counter diuretics, which are usually okay as long as you take them as indicated on the box. But when you start taking excessive quantities of these, you can cause massive ion disturbances, and you can end up killing yourself. Okay, hormone imbalance can also cause this. You probably don't know this hormone well yet. We will learn about it a lot this semester. Its job is to regulate sodium and potassium levels, and if the hormone is off, you're going to have a potassium disorder. And then if your kidneys are failing you, and they're just dumping excessive quantities of potassium, then that can also cause hypokalemia. Okay, so now let's do the opposite one. The opposite one is hyperkalemia. And hyperkalemia is what level of what where? Too much potassium, extracellular fluid. Good. Okay, so that means that the concentration gradient for potassium is going to be screwed up in a different way, right? So you're not affecting the 30, at least not initially. You're affecting the 1, right? So you are going to have too much potassium in the extracellular fluid. So now maybe it's 30, not 30 to 1, but 30 to 10, right? Which is 3 to 1, okay? Now remember that you depend on your potassium concentration gradient for repolarization, right? Okay, massive amounts of sodium in, and then massive amounts of potassium out. So the biggest problem with this one, not the only problem, but the biggest problem with this one is that too much potassium in the extracellular fluid makes it difficult to repolarize quickly and dependably. That means that for all practical purposes, your cell is useless until it repolarizes. You cannot use it for another action potential. So the big one with this one, again, is your electrical tissue that depends on rhythmicity, which is your heart. Your heart needs to depolarize, and then you need to repolarize so that you can use it again. Well, what if it gets stuck after it depolarizes and it can't repolarize? So this will cause massive changes in your EKG. And it can cause EEG changes too, but usually the brain changes aren't even noticed because the heart thing will kill you so quickly. It will cause severe muscle weakness, can lead to paralysis. It's usually temporary if you can get some of your hyperkalemia fixed. And then it can and will cause death by cardiac arrest. It is up to 67% fatal if left untreated, which is why we use it to kill people. This is the basis of death by lethal injection. So death by lethal injection injects a massive quantity of a really high potassium concentration solution. It's usually potassium hydroxide, which is not even hard to get. You can totally get it in the lab. So it gives massive quantities of, I know so many ways to kill people. It's like keeps my marriage very stable, so you know. You inject massive quantities, and what happens is it gets into your blood plasma and therefore gets to your heart, and your heart depolarizes and then tries to repolarize and cannot. So this is death by lethal injection. When they do death by lethal injection, there's actually a triple cocktail, and the triple cocktail is an anti-anxiety drug like a benzodiazepine, and then a muscle relaxer. Muscle relaxer is primarily for the people who are watching the injection, so that you don't seize up during the process. And then the third one,
What is the seizing due to?
It's due to the initial potassium disturbance, and it's hard to explain, but it's due to the initial potassium disturbance. So the muscle seizure will occur, and then the potassium will actually stop the heart. But fascinatingly, we are having a harder time in this country killing people because most of the drugs that we use for death by lethal injection are made by other countries, other westernized countries, other first world westernized countries that don't have the death penalty. And as a matter of fact, most first world Western countries do not have the death penalty. And they figured out that that's what we were using it for, and they are no longer shipping it to us. They will no longer give it to us. Hippocratic Oath, right? First do no harm. They're also having trouble having doctors to even attend lethal injections. There has to be a doctor there, but you take an oath, first do no harm. And so now they've had all kinds of things that have happened because we can't get the drugs in the quantities that we want. Like in Oklahoma, like 2 years ago, the guy who they tried to do death by lethal injection, and it took him hours to die. Yeah, a new cocktail, because they couldn't get the old cocktail. So they tried the new cocktail. So yeah, it's either we're gonna have to figure out how to make it in the quantities that we use it, or maybe we can reconsider killing people. I'm from Texas, and we kill more people than the rest of the damn planet combined, right? But yeah, if you kill somebody in Texas, we will kill you back. Disproportionately if you're a brown person, however, which is one of the reasons to reconsider the death penalty, right? So white, rich people don't die very often by the death penalty. I don't know what that's all about. So anyway, that's death by lethal injection. That's how that works. There's also another interesting, clinically relevant hyperkalemia thing, and that is that if you are a burn victim, you have severe, massive damage to your cell membranes, a whole bunch of them. Let's say I've got third-degree burns over 80% of my body, right? One of the many, many ways that you are at risk of death is because if you damage that many cell membranes, then what happens to all of that intracellular potassium? It goes into the extracellular fluid, circulates, can go to your heart and kill you. Okay, so immediately after your burn, you're at really high risk of heart attack. But there are actually some intravenous solutions they can do that will actually gobble up the potassium to keep it from actually impacting your heart. So they know that.
And the potassium's just going up, just to keep you.
No, it just damaged. I mean, where does it go? If you damage the cell membrane, it just gets dumped into the extracellular fluid. It's not even trying to maintain homeostasis. It's just like there's no more door. It just like goes out. It just diffuses. Go ahead.
So the Western countries that are making that death cocktail but not putting people to death, is it to treat like the hypokalemia?
Yeah, it's actually a medically useful treatment. Yes, they are making these drugs for actually using for medical purposes. But we are buying them in massive quantities so that we can use them for lethal injection. And then somebody eventually figured out, as a matter of fact, it was actually an investigative reporter that went and investigated where they were coming from and then came back and reported to the company that it was making that it was being used for that. And then they were like, no, we're not selling it to you anymore. And so it like went all black market and weird, and now we're having a lot of trouble figuring it out. What? What'd you say? And then we kill them with the same cocktail, exactly. It's an interesting story. Yeah, it's at least a conversation that's worth having, I think. Okay, so hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia can also be due to a hormone imbalance, the same hormone in a different way. Okay, now hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia, we haven't talked about calcium in the context of any of this yet. So, and it's not directly related to the story, but it's peripherally related to the story, and it's kind of interesting. So calcium has a functionality with these whole things that in electrically excitable tissues, like nervous and muscle tissues, the latch on your voltage-gated sodium channels is extracellular calcium. So I want you to imagine that extracellular calcium is sitting there, keeping it closed until it's stimulated to open, right? So if your door doesn't have a latch, then it just opens willy-nilly. Well, this one has an extracellular calcium latch. So what happens if you get hypocalcemia, which is low what where? Calcium in the extracellular fluid. If you get low calcium in the extracellular fluid, you have inappropriate, unstimulated opening of sodium channels. Sodium channels, sodium. Yeah, so if your sodium channels are open when you didn't mean them to be, that means it's a little easier to depolarize. You may be even slightly depolarized all the time. And so instead of sitting at -70, you might be sitting at -65. And so what you meant to be a graded potential ends up being an action potential, right? And so you get spontaneous, inappropriate action potentials that can lead to muscle spasms and twitches. It can lead to convulsions because of the stuff that happens in the stomach. If it gets really serious, it can lead to tetanic contractions of your muscles where you can't relax at all. But where you guys have probably experienced it is that damn little twitch that happens in your eye that nobody else can see, right? And it's like driving you crazy, and you're like, are you seeing this? And they're like, no, I don't see it. Those are usually due to ion imbalances, and the two most common ion imbalances to cause that are potassium and calcium. So if you just go eat a banana and drink a glass of milk, you'll probably be golden, especially if you take a nap, because it's also stress related. The stress screws up the hormones screw up the ions. Okay, so causes: decreased intake, again, starvation. Lack of vitamin D. Now, if you're taking in all of the calcium in the world, but you're not making adequate levels of vitamin D, you can't absorb it. So lack of vitamin D will cause problems. And you can see that this was probably a big issue when during the Industrial Revolution, I don't know if you guys know this, during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, there was so much coal pollution that the kids stopped getting enough vitamin D from the sun. And so they started to have all kinds of calcium deficiencies, and this was another one that you get because of that. Low parathyroid hormone or high calcitonin. I don't know if you guys learned in anatomy, but I teach in anatomy. These two hormones are the two hormones that regulate your blood plasma calcium levels. So if those are screwed up, you can have calcium problems. If you didn't learn them in anatomy, I'll teach them to you when we do the endocrine system. So symptoms of long-term low calcium that can lead to hypocalcemia: dry skin, psoriasis, coarse hair, brittle nails. But it's not particularly helpful because those are also just symptoms of living in Utah, right? It's like everything is dry, right? So yeah, those are some of the symptoms that can lead to hypocalcemia. Okay, and then the last one is the most common one. This is the one that lands most people in the hospital, usually in the middle of summer. So hyponatremia, it's what level of what where? Low sodium in the extracellular fluid, exactly. Okay, so here's what happens. The concentration gradient for sodium is not as steep as it should be. It should be what to what? Outside to inside. 15 to 1. Now let's say it's 5 to 1. Okay, you guys with me? And so some of the symptoms are that it's harder to depolarize, and so it can cause muscle weakness and nausea. But an even more important symptom has to do with the osmotic effect on the cells. So this one has a profound osmotic effect because if sodium is your primary source of extracellular ions and you lose massive quantities of sodium, then your cell goes from sitting in an isotonic solution to sitting in a what solution? Not hyper, I lost solutes. Hypotonic, okay? And that will cause cells to swell, right? Now, most of the time you don't really care about cells swelling, but if your neurons swell, you're screwed. Because if their structure changes, then their function changes, and they don't send signals as well as they should. Like, I'm swelling that axon, and now the actual, the dominoes are further apart from one another, right? So you're not necessarily going to get signals. So it can cause dramatic neurological symptoms. You like act like batshit crazy. Like all of a sudden, you're just like acting like a total nut. In addition, though, it's usually associated with hypotension and low blood plasma volume. So usually your blood pressure is pretty low, because this usually happens because of massive amounts of sweating, diarrhea, diuretics. Really, really likely to happen in the middle of the summer, especially if you're drinking beer. So this is like the Texas disease. Utah has rednecks too, don't think I haven't noticed. However, you're not usually as drunk as we are. So what happens in Texas, you go out on your boat, right, and you take some beer. And it's real beer in Texas too. So it's got a lot more alcohol. So you gotta go out on your boat, and then you're not eating very well, right? Because who's got time for that? And it just basically takes up beer room anyway. So you're going out on your boat, and then you're sweating like crazy. And then if it's a really, really bad day, you're also puking over the side of the boat as you're peeing over the side of the boat. You got to keep moving forward, by the way. You can't hang out. So then what happens is all of a sudden your friend Bubba is acting like a nut. And he's a little bit violent, but it's okay, because Bubba, with violent tendencies and low blood pressure, like tries to take a swing with you, and it just keeps going. And then they end up in the hospital, and somebody thinks they're on drugs, but no, they're not on drugs. It's just hyponatremia. And it's pretty easily treated in the ER, as long as you don't let yourself get so depleted that you actually die of it. So decreased intake, excessive sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, and diuretics. Kidney failure can also cause this. Hormones, there's two hormones that are related to your sodium and water concentration, and they are ADH and aldosterone, and if those are off, you can end up with these disorders. Poor diet combined with lots of beer, read Texas, or ecstasy. So we're going to talk about what MDMA actually does to the brain in the next set of notes. But the only deaths that have occurred because of ecstasy are not because of the impacts on the brain. It's because of the depletion of the ions that actually causes. So MDMA or ecstasy, not used in clinical situations. They actually use it for PTSD now. You can use it in clinical situations. It's got some really good uses. But I'm talking about party drug, MDMA. Okay, so you're using it as a party drug, and here's what it does. It makes you want to dance for like 8 hours, right, or have sex for 8 hours, but definitely not drink, right? You are not going to replace your fluids. I mean, you might drink alcohol, but that's another diuretic. So if you add MDMA and alcohol together, and then you don't replenish any of your fluids, then you end up with all of the hypo disorders, and sometimes you end up with hyponatremia. And if it gets disturbed enough and causes a big enough brain disturbance, it's just because of the osmosis. It's not actually because of the neuroactive activity of MDMA in your brain. So there have been a few people, not that many, who have died of MDMA use, and it's usually related to their ion composition and not actually to the neurotransmission that it causes. So that's MDMA. So not that you would ever do this, but your friend, you know that one friend that you have who's done MDMA a time or two, tell him to take a damn Gatorade with them, all right? Because nobody should die because of youthful indiscretions, right? Otherwise, we'd all be pregnant and dead. Right? We would. Everybody be pregnant, everybody be dead. You'd have 12 children by the time you were 25. Okay, so this is the most common electrolyte imbalance, which is hyponatremia. Now, because all of these hypos are associated with loss of fluid, you have to be very, very careful with your children when they lose fluids. You have to replace their fluids and their electrolytes. And by the way, electrolytes is just a fancy way for people to refer to ions. That's all it is. So if you look on the back of your Gatorade, most of us don't need to drink Gatorade because you don't need that kind of sugar. But Pedialyte's just Gatorade without the delicious stuff in it. That's all it is. Okay, so everybody good? Okay, so what are you going to have to do with these? You're going to need to tell me about one of these. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you which one. So what you need to do is you need to start with the stimulus, which is the title, and then you need to go through the progression of how you actually get there. That make sense? Okay. All right, so I'm going to briefly, just briefly, and you guys are going to get out early because I had to let the other class out early. It was partly my fault because my husband's car wouldn't start this morning, and so he needed me to jump his car, or else I had to get a divorce. So I was late for class. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this set of notes is going to be about. This set of notes immediately it follows what happened in the last one, because here is where we just ended it. We just said that I can get an action potential to go all the way to the end of the cell without stopping. But what we didn't say is what's going to happen when it gets to the end of the cell. And so what's going to happen when it gets to the end of the cell is the next set of notes, which is talking about synapses. And synapses are where a neuron communicates with another cell, right? So what is going to happen is a little preview of things to come. What is generally going to happen, and hopefully you remember a little bit about synapses from anatomy. It's the site of communication between a neuron and another neuron, or between a neuron and a muscle or a gland cell. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to start the story just like we started it before. We're going to dump a whole bunch of chemical on the chemical gated channels on the cell body. And if you hit threshold, you are going to start an action potential which will go all the way to the end. When it goes all the way to the end, what it will do is start a series of activities which will cause you to release neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters, by the way, are just another chemical, right? That chemical is now going to dump onto the cell body of the next cell, right? And potentially depolarize it to threshold so that you can get it to send a signal to the next cell, right? And this is basically just a little chain reaction that you are going to start that allows communication between neurons, right? Neuron to neuron communication. And so this set of notes, what we are going to be talking about is this mechanism of releasing the neurotransmitters. And then we're going to talk about the types of neurotransmitters that we know exist, right? And there's still some that we're discovering all the time. It's a little harder to find a neurotransmitter than it is to find a hormone, right? Because it's just released in minute quantities and then immediately gotten rid of, right? So we're still finding them. So we're going to talk about the neurotransmitters that we know. We'll talk about some diseases that have to do with neurotransmitters. And of course, we're going to talk about drugs because that makes neurotransmitters interesting. So even if you're totally anti-drug, aren't you curious why people would want to do them? I think that's a good question to be able to answer before you tell your child not to.
Yeah.
Be like, why would anybody want to do opium? Oh, only because it causes this massive release of pleasure chemicals in your brain? You need to be armed with that information because they're going to find it out later, just so you know. What?
Antidepressants and stuff do the same thing, though, right?
They do something different. They work with different neurotransmitters, yeah. But I'll teach you all of the major drugs and neurotransmitters as we go through. Yeah, this is my favorite set of notes because I love brain chemistry. Love it. Okay, so I'm going to stop early for today. You guys are going to go home and study, right? Okay.